Lewis Hamilton is re-signing with Mercedes. Want to know why he's going public with it on Friday the 8th? Want to know if he'll be joining Mercedes this season or if he'll wait until 2026? If you're curious, this video is for you. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Lewis Hamilton, the man whose legacy has become inseparable from the very fabric of Formula One history, has just turned the world of motorsport upside down. Not with an overproduced marketing blitz, not with a carefully staged photo op or a team-rehearsed press release, but with a quiet, emotionally raw declaration that has already left an indelible mark on the soul of racing. After months of relentless speculation, subtle signs, and coded gestures, the moment of clarity has finally arrived. The man who once redefined excellence behind the wheel in silver is returning to where his fire was first forged, Mercedes-AMG Petronas. Not for a nostalgic lap around the past, but for a new battle, a new chapter, 2026 and 2027, sealed and written with defiance, purpose, and perhaps a vengeance yet untold. But what makes this revelation so earth-shattering isn't just the sporting implications, though they are massive, it's the raw humanity behind it. Beneath the layers of racing contracts and tire compounds, beyond the timing sheets and podium champagne, lies a man who never lost his essence, even when draped in red and swallowed by silence. His return isn't just a career move. It's a reclamation. A roar of self-worth disguised as a whisper. It's a declaration that sometimes, leaving home doesn't mean forgetting it. It means remembering who you were before you were asked to be someone else. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Hamilton didn't make this announcement via a brand-sponsored mini-documentary or a glossy corporate rollout orchestrated by layers of marketing departments. There were no pit wall soundbites, no token team principal quotes, no major F1 media platforms with exclusive rights. He did it alone. Unfiltered. With intention. He looked straight into the eye of the world from the lens of his own phone, and he spoke not with volume, but with weight. He posted a solitary grayscale image. No filters, no flashy edits, just a simple moment of reflection frozen in time. His face turned slightly away, a portrait of quiet rebellion. Below it, not a paragraph and a half, just 8 words. Each one a bullet, each one a drumbeat. Home is where the respect lives. I'm coming back. And with that sentence, the emotional floodgates of Formula One collapsed. In an instant, timelines exploded, forums caught fire, group chats lit up like paddock telemetry on race day. This wasn't just an update, it was an eruption. This wasn't news. It was catharsis. Hamilton didn't just post a caption. He detonated a truth bomb. One that resonated not only with fans but also with those within the very heart of the sport who had quietly observed his increasing detachment, his growing frustration, the thinning smile behind each media interview in red. For those who truly watched, not the races but the man, this wasn't a surprise. It was a sigh of relief. Because for more than a year, something had clearly been misaligned. The Lewis Hamilton who walked into Ferrari was hopeful, determined, reborn even. But the Lewis Hamilton that appeared in post-race press conferences began to look less like a 7-time world champion and more like a prisoner of his own expectations. The sparkle dulled. The connection frayed. The performance, sporadic. The chemistry, practically non-existent. There were awkward podium moments, subtle avoidance on team radio, stilted energy in garage footage. Whispers became louder. Speculation turned into headlines. And yet, through it all, Hamilton said nothing. Until now. With his announcement, he chose not to rage, but to reveal. Not to attack, but to reflect. His words were a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Precision over aggression. Truth over theatrics. He painted a picture not of betrayal, but of misalignment. Of promises whispered in negotiations, but drowned in politics once the doors closed. He spoke of a dream that turned into duty, of enthusiasm met with executive indifference, of a culture that smiled for the cameras but closed ranks behind the scenes. Every day, I stepped into that garage believing we were building together, he wrote. But as time went on, I realized I was laying bricks alone. That sentence, simple, unpretentious, cut deeper than any exposé or media leak ever could. Because in that one line, the entire illusion of the Ferrari fairy tale collapsed. The allure of red, the myth of unity, the facade of legacy, it all dissolved into dust. This wasn't just about racing. This was about respect. About being heard. About wanting to contribute and create, not just to perform and obey. Hamilton didn't walk away from Ferrari because he couldn't handle the pressure. He walked away because he refused to be muted, to be used, to be paraded without being valued. And now, with the weight of those years behind him, he returns not as a prodigal son, but as a warrior who's seen the other side and chosen fire over comfort. This isn't a comeback rooted in nostalgia, it's an uprising. A demand to be seen, not just celebrated. A stand against the quiet erosion of identity that happens when greatness is taken for granted. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Hamilton's re-entry into the Mercedes fold isn't just a headline. It's a warning shot to the entire grid. He's not coming back to relive the past. He's coming to rewrite the future. With scars that speak louder than his trophies. With silence that now sings louder than any engine. He isn't chasing redemption, he is redemption. And in this new era, the message is crystal clear. When Lewis Hamilton says he's coming home, it's not just about where he's going. It's about who he refuses to be ever again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word he delivered carried the weight of years spent swallowing disappointment, of seasons buried beneath layers of political maneuvering and false promises. It was more than a critique. It was a quiet confession, spoken with the poise of a man who had waited far too long to be truly heard. That sentence, heavy with metaphor and threaded with raw emotion, wasn't just a reflection of recent frustrations. It was a reflection of years slowly unraveling, of hope turning into hesitation, and then into heartbreak. It captured an entire era where he, a titan of the sport, a name etched into the very DNA of Formula One, was made to feel expendable. It was a quiet eulogy for a dream that never fully bloomed. When he first stepped into Maranello, the red overalls weren't just fabric. They were history, promise, and potential stitched together. He wasn't naive. He knew the culture, the weight of legacy, the burden of expectation. But what he didn't expect, what no one truly can prepare for, was the slow erosion of identity under the guise of tradition. He had been promised a project, a mission, a revival. What he received was a role already defined, confined, and inflexible. They didn't want a leader. They wanted a legend to hang in their hallway, a name to market, a headline to control the news cycle. The partnership, at its core, had always been a mirage, glittering from afar, hollow from within. His voice faltered only slightly as he peeled back the curtain on the organization's inner workings. This wasn't just about tire choices or pit stop calls. It was about an ecosystem where true collaboration was an illusion. Meetings where voices spoke, but only some were heard. A culture where nods were given, agreements pretended, yet decisions had already been etched into stone behind tightly shut doors. Innovation suffocated beneath layers of protocol. Creativity drowned by hierarchy. The promise of joint development and mutual respect quietly extinguished by egos far more interested in control than in victory. He didn't accuse. He illuminated. Not to damage, but to explain. To finally bring clarity to the disconnect the world had only guessed at for months. He had not come to Ferrari to be a footnote. He hadn't walked away from comfort, familiarity, and legacy at Mercedes just to be another line in a press release or a brand ambassador in red. He came to shape something new. But with each passing race, the scaffolding around him grew tighter. Not structurally, but symbolically. The feedback he offered, honed through years of championship-winning experience, sharpened by the harshest battles on the world's fastest circuits, was taken, nodded at, and filed away to be forgotten. He became less a driver in development and more a diplomat in exile. Beneath the surface of press conferences and media smiles, there was tension no camera could fully capture. The dynamic with Charles Leclerc, once framed as respectful rivalry, had mutated into something altogether more complex. At first, Hamilton had embraced the idea of mentoring, of building a partnership rooted in mutual ambition. But subtle patterns began to emerge. Strategy choices began leaning toward Leclerc with consistency that no longer seemed coincidental. Setup adjustments seemed to favor his driving style, often at the cost of balance for Hamilton. There were quiet glances exchanged in debriefs, not of animosity, but of confusion, of slowly dawning realization. A coldness crept in, not overt hostility, but an unmistakable distancing. To the world, it still looked like unity. Smiles for the cameras. Handshakes in the paddock. But in private, the silence between them was louder than any argument. Decisions were made in ways that subtly reinforced who the team truly backed. Even when Lewis's input was offered with the clarity and depth that only a 7-time world champion could bring, it was rarely echoed back in the room. His voice didn't vanish, it was simply absorbed, ignored, made invisible. Not through confrontation, but through indifference. Not through dismissal, but through delay. The team meetings became ritualistic exercises in pretended parity, while the real direction had already been mapped elsewhere. The truth, though dressed in diplomacy and wrapped in professionalism, was brutal in its simplicity. He was not there to build a future, he was there to serve a narrative. The contradiction gnawed at him. He wasn't a relic to be displayed. He was still fierce, still sharp, still hungry. And yet, Ferrari had placed him in a paradox. Celebrated, yet not trusted, respected, yet not empowered. They had welcomed a warrior, but handed him a script. And with each race, each qualifying session, each moment where he felt his ideas diluted or redirected, he came to understand that his role had been set long before he ever stepped into that garage. And so, in one devastatingly poetic sentence, he encapsulated it all. Not just frustration, but betrayal. Not just exclusion, but disillusionment. He didn't need to shout. The silence around him had said enough. Whispers began to seep through the cracks of Ferrari's once impenetrable walls. What started as subtle murmurs turned into persistent leaks, each one peeling back another layer of a fractured team dynamic. Inside the garages and meeting rooms, microaggressions took root, not with overt declarations, but with knowing glances, with a quiet exclusion from informal technical huddles, with feedback filtered through loyalty rather than merit. The engineers, once a unified force devoted to innovation and excellence, began to divide into hushed factions. Some aligned themselves with the familiar rhythms of the old guard, while others found themselves hesitating, unsure whose data to champion, whose telemetry to emphasize, whose voice to elevate when decisions had to be made under pressure. The analysts, often overlooked but deeply embedded in the rhythm of race weekends, took subtle cues on whose feedback carried more weight. A nod in a debrief here, a pointed omission in a report there, every small gesture began to send loud messages. Briefings that once fueled collaboration now morphed into echo chambers where challenging the narrative was quietly discouraged. Unity became performance art. Behind closed doors, division festered. And yet, amidst the growing tension, Lewis Hamilton said nothing publicly. He didn't air grievances. He didn't leak his own frustrations. He didn't retaliate in press conferences or stir the waters behind the scenes. He did what champions do, he kept racing. He buried himself in data. He leaned into the grind. He held on to the belief that things could turn around, that the storm would pass, that Ferrari, with all its legacy and promise, could become the platform for a historic resurgence. He gave them the benefit of his immense patience, his legacy, his relentless pursuit of greatness. But that patience was not infinite. Austria. A circuit steeped in history and beauty, but on that afternoon, it became the backdrop for a seismic shift within Ferrari. Inside what was supposed to be a neutral space, a sanctuary for strategy, improvement, and mutual respect, Frédéric Vasseur, the team principal trusted with leading Ferrari into a new era, delivered a message that detonated the tension that had been silently building for months. With no warning and in full view of the engineering staff, Vasseur looked Hamilton in the eye and said, coldly and without pause, "You're not adapting fast enough. Charles is the benchmark." The words didn't just hang in the air, they shattered it. The room, once alive with keyboard taps, telemetry chatter, and overlapping voices, fell into an oppressive silence. You could hear the weight of the moment in the sudden stillness. Colleagues froze. Some looked away. Others instinctively closed laptops, as if shielding themselves from the blast. The oxygen seemed to vanish, replaced by a thick fog of disbelief and discomfort. And at the center of it all stood Hamilton, absorbing every syllable, not flinching, not blinking, not showing the heartbreak or the fury that had to be boiling beneath the surface. When he finally responded, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The power wasn't in volume, it was in conviction, in legacy, in truth. "I didn't come here to be second fiddle," he said, eyes steady, words razor-sharp. "I'm not a backup dancer. I'm an 8-time world champion." No shouting. No theatrics. Just a line drawn in the sand by a man who had nothing left to prove, but everything to fight for. In that instant, the fragile illusion of harmony shattered completely. The myth of a unified Ferrari team collapsed under the weight of its own denial. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was transformative. Everyone in that room knew something irreversible had occurred. A door had been opened, and no one could close it again. From that moment forward, the atmosphere around the team changed in ways that couldn't be quantified by lap times or tire degradation charts. Trust eroded. The shared mission splintered. People walked on eggshells. Some avoided eye contact. Others whispered in corners. Ferrari was no longer one team pulling in the same direction. It was a house divided, crippled by internal politics, clinging to outdated traditions, and perhaps most damning of all, blind to the opportunity it was squandering. They had recruited a living legend not to elevate him, but to use him, and when he refused to conform to the role they had assigned him, they tried to diminish him. But legends don't shrink in the face of adversity. They expand. And in the echo of that Austrian confrontation, Hamilton's resolve didn't falter, it calcified. Because sometimes, silence is not submission. Sometimes, it's the calm before a storm. In the deepest chambers of Ferrari's Maranello headquarters, far away from the whispers of the media, removed from the ever-watchful eyes of the press team and insulated from the eager ears of strategists and sponsors, a private meeting was set. No entourage. No advisors. No digital recordings or polite interruptions. Just two individuals separated not by distance but by a growing abyss of misaligned visions, mounting resentment, and a fundamental collapse of trust. On one side sat Frederick Vasseur, calm, calculated, and according to several whispers from within the Scuderia, brutally direct. On the other stood Lewis Hamilton, stoic, reserved, and increasingly aware that the dream he had bought into was nothing more than a carefully crafted mirage. Vasseur's words, devoid of any emotional cushion, landed with surgical precision. We're building the future around Charles. He's younger. He's the cornerstone of our long-term vision. That single statement, delivered without hesitation or apology, echoed like a death knell for any remaining illusion of equal footing. The veil of mutual ambition was pulled back, revealing a hierarchy that had always been there, silent, strategic, and now undeniable. Hamilton didn't respond immediately. He stood slowly, the silence between them louder than any raised voice or angry accusation. His expression betrayed nothing, but the gravity in his tone made it clear, this wasn't shock. This was confirmation. "You should have told me from the beginning," he said, his voice steady but carrying a tremor of betrayal that no composure could fully conceal. "If I was just a bridge, I never would have crossed it." There was no hand extended. No farewell. No mutual nod of respect. Just the soft, final click of a door closing behind him. Not with the fury of indignation, but with the finality of a man who has seen behind the curtain and realized the stage was never his to stand on. What walked out that day wasn't just a world champion. It was a man stripped of pretense, stripped of illusion, and painfully aware that he had been cast not as a partner but as a placeholder. But the rupture didn't end in that room. It spread, quietly at first, then with the speed of wildfire through the team structure. In Silverstone, his homeland, his sanctuary, a circuit etched into his soul, everything came undone. Away from cameras and journalists, in what was supposed to be a routine strategy briefing, tensions erupted. What began as a disagreement escalated when Hamilton, still simmering with mistrust, questioned whether Leclerc had played a role in a recent race decision that had dramatically undermined his performance. The room fell still when he posed the question, and Leclerc's answer, though wrapped in corporate neutrality, pierced like a blade. "The team does what's best for the team." A diplomatic response on paper, but Hamilton heard it for what it was, a mask. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. But the ice in his reply made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "No," he said coldly. "They do what's best for you. Don't ever mistake my silence for surrender." From that moment, the already delicate dynamic inside Ferrari began to disintegrate beyond repair. Invisible lines formed inside the garage. Conversations grew shorter. Trust vanished. Engineers who once moved fluidly between sides now stuck to their respective zones. A once united team began to function like two camps forced into a shared space, operationally efficient, emotionally fractured. Still, Hamilton showed up. Still, he got in the car. Still, he delivered laps that few others on the grid could replicate, but what he carried with him wasn't just speed, it was solitude. Every race was no longer about positions or points, it became a battle to reclaim identity. A fight not for trophies, but for something deeper. For dignity. For agency. For the right to define his narrative on his own terms. He wasn't chasing records anymore. He was chasing peace. Relevance. Truth. Behind the helmet was no longer just a 7-time world champion. It was a man standing alone on a battlefield, surrounded by silence, politics, and shadows of promises broken. He drove not because of them, but in spite of them. Not for applause, but for meaning. Because sometimes, the greatest act of rebellion isn't walking away. It's staying, driving through the storm, and refusing to let them write the final chapter. After the Canadian Grand Prix, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just frustration anymore, it was detachment. The kind that creeps in slowly but announces itself all at once, in the silence that follows disappointment. He stayed behind while the engineers packed up. No cameras, no entourage, just him, alone with thoughts that had become too loud to ignore. The strategy call that day had once again stripped him of a chance, not just at points or podiums, but at purpose. And in that stillness, almost unconsciously, his fingers hovered over the contacts on his phone until they landed on a name he hadn't dared to call in over a year. He stared at it for a moment, then pressed dial. It rang once, twice. Then a voice he knew better than his own answered, calm, composed, unmistakable. Toto Wolff. There was no grand opening, no rehearsed speech. Words weren't needed at first. What filled the silence was something deeper, recognition. A bond not built in boardrooms but in the trenches of 1,000 battles, both won and lost. Their history stretched beyond trophies. It lived in the way they had fought for each other, how they had once understood the rhythm of ambition and the fragility of greatness. And when Lewis finally spoke, it wasn't a statement, it was a confession. "They don't see me anymore," he said quietly, the weight behind his voice cutting through the line like thunder wrapped in velvet. "They see the brand, the logo, the narrative. But not the hunger. Not the man. Not the reason I started racing in the first place." On the other end, Toto didn't pause for long. He didn't need time to think, he'd felt it too. From afar, he had watched the spark dim, the joy replaced by obligation, the rebel tamed by routine. And when he spoke, it wasn't a business proposition, it was a promise. "Then come home," he said, not with desperation but with certainty. "Let's take back the pen and write your ending on your terms." The conversation ended without needing a yes or no. It was already done. The rest was logistics, time, trust, and absolute discretion. A few weeks later, in a nondescript building just outside Vienna, far from the flash of paddocks or the glare of media, 2 men sat across from each other, surrounded not by lawyers or cameras but by the silence of mutual respect. No press officers. No brand managers. No agenda. Just a shared understanding that this was not about rewriting history, but reclaiming it. Hamilton didn't come with a list of demands, but he made one thing crystal clear. There would be no worship, no hierarchy, no carefully constructed PR fairy tales. He would not return to be idolized or managed. He would return to compete. To be a gladiator again. His only non-negotiable was authenticity, pure equality. No preferences. No politicking. No sideshows. He wasn't chasing redemption. He was chasing reality. Racing, raw and honest. Either he'd earn his place again with nothing held back, or he wouldn't come at all. Toto met those words not with hesitation but with resolve. This wasn't about a comeback. This was about resurrection. And for both of them, it was about something even more sacred, legacy. Not the kind etched in gold, but the kind that lives in the hearts of those who dare to fight for truth in a world obsessed with appearances. The agreement was forged in silence, shielded from the ravenous noise of the sport. There were no leaks, no hints, not even whispers. Only a handful of people on Earth even knew the meeting had taken place. Because this was never meant to be a transaction, it was a reunion. A restoration of purpose. A decision grounded not in money or marketing, but in something far more rare in Formula One, conviction. And with that, the wheels were already turning, long before the world would ever know. On the morning of August 8th, the motorsport world stood still as an entire era shifted with the weight of a single revelation. This wasn't another publicity stunt wrapped in nostalgia. It wasn't a carefully orchestrated marketing maneuver designed to reignite a fanbase or boost merchandise sales. It wasn't a desperate grasp at glory or a twilight swan song masquerading as ambition. No, Lewis Hamilton's decision to return to Mercedes wasn't about image, or legacy polishing, or financial gain. It was something deeper, rawer, more human. It was a reclamation of everything he had once embodied, everything that had been challenged, doubted, undermined, and nearly erased during his turbulent, fragmented, and ultimately disillusioning stint at Ferrari. This was not a man returning to familiar ground. This was a man returning to his spiritual center, his competitive soul, the place where his voice had always echoed loudest and clearest. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even redemption. It was rebirth. And the message he chose to deliver this rebirth wasn't shouted at a press conference or whispered through sources or teased in a cryptic interview. It arrived quietly, humbly, yet powerfully, through an Instagram post that struck with the emotional precision of 1,000 podium speeches. The caption read like scripture to his most loyal fans, a coded message packed with gratitude, resolve, and restrained fury. To Mercedes it began, "Thank you for remembering who I am when others tried to make me forget." That wasn't just a line, it was a declaration, a thunderclap across the digital sky, a subtle but unmistakable blow to those who had doubted, dismissed, or tried to reframe his narrative. With a single sentence, he turned the last 2 years of his career on their head, not through bitterness or blame, but through clarity and grace. And the image that accompanied it? A photo that could have been taken yesterday or 20 years ago, his very first silver race suit, delicately hung in solitude within a softly illuminated garage. There were no flames, no flashes, no fireworks, just stillness. And the caption beneath it carried the weight of history, "Coming home. 2026. Let's finish this right." The reaction was immediate, visceral, and volcanic. Social media collapsed under the sheer volume of emotion. Fans screamed, cried, cheered, and flooded comment sections with stories of what Lewis had meant to them, not just as a driver, but as a symbol of perseverance, principle, and pride. Hashtags trended. TikToks bloomed. Tributes were born. People who hadn't watched a race in years felt something stir inside them again. Former teammates and rivals, some surprised, others not, reached out in quiet solidarity. Celebrities posted. Journalists scrambled. Podcasts dropped emergency episodes. And Mercedes? They responded with surgical precision. Just one post. One image. One caption that said it all: "He's back." Meanwhile, Ferrari's silence was deafening. No farewell video. No tribute post. No heartfelt quote from a team principal. Not even a thank you. The silence spoke louder than any eulogy, amplifying the sense that something had been lost, broken, or perhaps never truly found within that red chapter of Hamilton's career. What should have been a celebration became a whisper. And yet, in that void, Lewis's voice rang even louder. Because this was never going to be just a return to old colors or familiar garages. This wasn't a sequel. It was a new volume. A rebirth of identity. A shedding of compromise. A reminder that while records matter and trophies glisten, true greatness is carved into the moments when an athlete dares to walk away from comfort, to challenge the world's perception of who they are, and to fight for their truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Hamilton's move wasn't about trying to recapture the past. It was about reclaiming the present. About walking back into the fire not to prove anything, but because the fire is where he was born. Because after years of being seen through the wrong lens, he had finally wiped it clean and turned it toward himself. No filters. No shadows. No misinterpretations. Just him. He's not chasing the ghost of his former self. He's walking side by side with it. And together, they're writing a finale that no statistic could ever quantify. One that's driven not by anger, but by purpose. Not by ego, but by truth. Not by applause, but by the quiet roar of someone who refuses to be rewritten by anyone but himself. This isn't just the return of a driver. It's the rise of a man who understands that legacy isn't gifted. It's fought for, lived through, broken, repaired, and ultimately shaped by the moments when everything seems lost, yet you still choose to stand. Lewis Hamilton doesn't need another championship to validate who he is. He doesn't need pole positions to define his worth. He doesn't need Ferrari's approval or the public's sympathy. What he needed, what he claimed on August 8th, was the freedom to define his own ending. And now, as the engines begin to hum in anticipation of 2026, the world isn't just watching a comeback. It's witnessing a reckoning. An awakening. A defiant, deliberate, unapologetic stand by someone who has already given everything, and still has more to say.